Hello, a warm welcome to Dan Really Likes Wine, presented by Pick and Pay, and welcome to a little gem I've discovered not too far from home. I didn't even know this place existed until a guy called Martin started annoying me on Twitter and telling me I had to come and check out his restaurant, and I'm very glad I have. It's called Tony G's, and it's the kind of Portuguese spot you know is going to be good because it doesn't look flash and they've spent 100 million rand on putting it all together. It looks like it's family run, like it's full of charm, full of soul, and full of great food. And that's part of the reason I'm here. But the other part of the reason I'm here is because a mate of mine just happens to be up from Cape Town. So I've made him hire a car and drive through Johannesburg, which people in Cape Town do not like to do. But he's been very brave and he's brought some of his wine along. Wine we've had on the show before. It's a very warm welcome, Alistair Rimmer.
Yeah, Dan, it's great to see you up in Joburg. Not on a Zoom call for once.
I know, all down at Kleine Zalze, which I love doing because it is so beautiful. But this is a little different and I think certainly has its own particular charm. Before we dive into the wine, I've got a real fondness for Portuguese food. I've spent time in the Algarve. I devour it very happily. Any great Portuguese meals you've had?
Yeah, well, I lived on the Iberian Peninsula for 3 years and the neighbor in Spain. I made wine there for 3 years. So I did delve across every now and again, but you know, the simplest seafood dishes down in the Algarve and the likes usually do the best. You know, and the salt cod that they all do that part of the world is a particular favorite of mine. And obviously this side of the world, you know, well, with our Mozambican influence, prawns are usually on the menu. So hopefully we might see some of them later on.
I suspect we will. It's a great country for food. It's also a surprisingly good country for wine, and you'll probably know that as well. I remember being there with my now wife, then girlfriend, and going out, and I was buying €20 bottles of Bordeaux, and she and her mates were buying €2 bottles of Portuguese wine, and it turned out their wine was much better than mine.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Portugal sort of lived in a bit of a shadow to Spain and some of the other better known European countries. Yeah, and it was sort of labelled as port from Portugal, and that was it. Yeah, but you get down to some of the reds out of the Algarve, and there's some beautiful textured wines. Yeah, and then up top, I mean, Vinho Verde, I think, was always seen as a very simple, table wine, which it can be, and it can be very delicious as that. But Alvarinho, the variety that they make their Vinho Verdes out of, is such an amazing variety, and it's an amazing food variety, and exceptionally good with seafood and the likes. It's got great texture. It's not the most aromatic of varieties, but texture, and it's, I suppose there's a reason why I like Alvarinho, in that, you'll see, I think, some commonality. We focus a lot about texture, and those whites out of northern Portugal and Galicia, which is part of Spain, but it's practically the same viticultural area, have inspired me from early on in my career when I first worked in Spain in 2003, and then got to discover the wines of Portugal back then as well. And some of the red wines, just the table red wines coming out of the Douro Valley now, are some of the finest in the world. And
incredibly good value, which is a nice link to South Africa, as are you, having spent time over there. And what they've inspired in you is the ability to make terrific wine. And it's not just me who thinks that. It's pretty much the entire world, Alistair, because I'm not sure there's an award that you and Kleine Zalze didn't win in 2020.
Yeah, we had a really good year in 2020. Sometimes you like to be good, but being good with a bit of luck on your side also helps. The wine scoring gods looked after us in 2020. We had an exceptional year, and it was crowned off at the end of the year being Platter's Winery of the Year, which was a great achievement. People know us obviously as a really interesting winery that makes good value wines. I think they sometimes forget that we also play in the upper echelons, and we sometimes compete with our smaller, more high-end neighbours that just focus on that. So it was nice to get a bit of recognition for that. But I'm fortunate enough to sit literally in front of the camera quite a lot and take a lot of credit for these wines. But as you know, and you've met a couple of the team, it's a big team effort. I've got a team of unbelievably talented winemakers. RJ Buerta heads the winemaking team up. Henning heads the viticultural and the vineyard team up. And those two are two of my right-hand people. And without them, these wines don't exist as good as they are. So while I take a lot of credit for it, I'm just one piece in a much bigger team.
Look, you're certainly not undeserving of credit, but you're right, your team do a terrific job, and the culmination of that work is the wine we have here from Kleine Zalze. And we've got a selection. And very simply what we're going to do here at Tony G's in Bedfordview is to try some white, and then Monica, who runs the restaurant, is going to give us something to try with that, and then we'll do the same with the red. We'll taste the wine though before the food comes along, just to get it in isolation. We've got a Chenin Blanc, we've got a Sauvignon Blanc. Conventional wisdom would say we try the Sauvignon Blanc first, but I suspect you might point me in another direction.
Yeah, generally your Sauvignons will be a lighter structured wine, and your Chenins, especially this barrel fermented Chenin, are generally bigger, bolder wines, more structure, and you go from the lighter to the heavier or the more structured wine. Our Sauvignon, again, we focus on texture and structure in our wines, more so than aromatics. This wine, the Sauvignon, is a very aromatic wine, and it's a very structured wine. And along with the aromatics and the structure, if you taste the Chenin after it can look a little bit quiet and a little bit subdued. So we like letting the Chenin show its subtlety off, and then the Sauvignon, especially this 2019 vintage, is an exceptional wine, but it's super aromatic. So we'll take that second, and it's got the shoulders to not also be overpowered by the Chenin before it. So let's have a look, see how it works out.
All right, not quite the usual order, but then it's never quite the usual order with Kleine Zalze. And if you look at that, I think this is the real reason he wants to try the Chenin first. He can show that off. It just happens to have 5 platter stars glowing out from the bottle. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to pour, because normally the winemakers pour for me, and then about 4 hours later, I'm having to get a taxi home. So there we go, we can top it up in a moment. First thing I want to try quickly, and cheers. Thank you for coming to join me, is the temperature. Because all too often, the South African approach is, if a penguin is not comfortable in temperature that the Sauvignon Blanc is at, then it is clearly too warm. And yet you're going to lose out on so much if you do freeze it to death.
I think it's a South African, not just a South African, but we're very guilty of it in South Africa. We generally serve our whites too cold and our reds too warm. You know, we're a warm climate, we've got these beautiful nuanced wines, especially with Chenin. There's a lot of subtle nuance to it, and when you serve it ice cold, you get a bit of the aromatics, but the flavor on the palate and the texture on the palate
closes
is lost.
down.
It closes down.
Yeah.
Sauvignon Blancs as well. And then the reds, you know, we're a warm climate, you know, we make beautiful, rich, ripe reds. You know, with, you know, alcohol's usually between 13 and about 14.5%. And if they're too warm, then you're just starting to taste alcohol, and it hides the subtlety of the wine. So generally I say, knock your reds down a few degrees and warm your whites up a few degrees to the general South African sort of thing. Everyone thinks of room temperature, but I think it's the old European room temperature before they invented central heating. You know, that 17 degrees is usually where reds get served, and white's only a few degrees cooler than that.
Yeah, if you're watching this at the moment in the middle of the Karoo, room temperature is not what you need to be drinking any wine at ever. So we've got this at optimum temperature, which means we're getting the most out of it as a Chenin Blanc. And it's great that now we're all well aware it's leading so much of South Africa's wine story around the world, either on its own or as part of a blend. And so now I'm really getting the sense that a Stellenbosch Chenin versus a Swartland Chenin versus a Chenin from Wellington perhaps, they've all got such clear hallmarks as to where they're from. But I think we can go even further than that now, and that even the different parts of Stellenbosch, you're finding that depending on where you're from, that style of Chenin Blanc is becoming increasingly distinctive.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it is a super expressive variety, and when you don't cloud it with too much winemaking influence, it is really a grape that shows place really well. You know, some of your more aromatic varieties hide that place, just like too much oak may hide it as well. Where Chenin is this very expressive variety. I suppose that's why, you know, the ultimate white terroir-driven wine is, you know, white Burgundy, Chardonnay out of Burgundy. You know, is all about terroir because it's actually quite a quiet, neutral variety. So it expresses the soil it's grown in much clearer than maybe something else. And Chenin does that in South Africa. And yeah, I've done a couple of tasting over the last decade where we've been doing regionality, but the broader regions, the Swartlands, the Stellenbosches, the Breda Kloof and the likes. And there is a beautiful distinction between the areas. We're very fortunate. Chenin does well all over the Western Cape and in South Africa. I reckon if you planted it in Joburg, it might work here too. But in all seriousness, yes, the sub-wards of Stellenbosch are starting to show definition, and we particularly like the area around Fora, which is for those that know the area, the place, the vineyards in Stellenbosch are the closest to False Bay. And that maritime influence, False Bay is a cold ocean. It's not like Durbs. It's the Benguela current coming down the west coast, cools it up. The ocean temperatures never get much up above 20. Most of the year they're sitting between about 15 and 18. And that cool air coming off the ocean just gives freshness. We have moved away from new oak at Kleine Zalze. We've moved away from malolactic fermentation and any botrytis. It was a style that was quite popular, which gave you a lot of sweet apricots, but I thought it masked the terroir, it masked the soils that were going. And for those who visited the Western Cape, you know the Helderberg is just there, and Forest sits on the foot slopes of the Helderberg, and it's all decomposed granite soils. And when you get Shannon in granite, it gives you this beautiful freshness without being acidic. And you get this beautiful texture. It's like this pithy, saline, salty sort of texture to the wine, and with a subtle fruit. It's a very subtle, integrated fruit. But for me, this wine's all about texture. And RJ and I have really moved away to getting to a wine that's subtle but shows a sense of place. And it's not 100% from the Fora area. There's a little bit of Portlaray, Devon Valley sort of side, right on the crown of that hill. We get a parcel of fruit that's got a bit of altitude and a bit of freshness. But there's 3 parcels that form 95% of this wine most years that are out of the Fora subward.
All right. Well, there's a reason it has got 5 stars. And part of it, as much as he tries to play down his role, is the meticulous attention to detail paid in creating this wine, but also, as you say, letting the wine tell its own story. And that's exactly what you've done. Ultimate test there is going to be with our Portuguese prawns, which are on their way shortly. But before we give those a crack, we also have a Sauvignon Blanc. And I'm really looking forward to trying this because you have said it must sit after the Chenin. There's a lovely delicacy to that Chenin Blanc. So now we're going to see, I'm expecting this Sauvignon to be just a little rowdier in comparison and see how it comes across.
That it is. So one thing I've got to mention, Dan, is that there is a sticker missing on that. That was one of our 5-star wines as well.
Just had to drop that in, didn't you?
Yeah,
not only that, there's a Sauvignon Blanc top 10, there's a Concours Mondial gold medal, there's a Veritas, and there's also a little sticker on the back here from Alistair's mum saying he's a very good boy. And I've got no doubt the entire Rimmer family is awfully proud of everything you do. This amongst them, the Sauvignon Blanc, we talk about the Chenin being so much of an expression of its place. Does that mean that the Sauvignon Blanc is a bit more work, it takes a bit more care and detail?
I think it does. I think it's for me personally as a winemaker, it's a more challenging variety to get it to a top level. It's I think relatively to make a nice pleasant Sauvignon, to make a world-class Sauvignon with texture and depth and not just a lot of aromatics and relatively neutral palate is quite challenging. We cast the net a bit broader on our Sauvignon Blanc. We love Stellenbosch Chenin and we try and express it. With this Sauvignon, we use 3 bigger units. We use a bit of Darling, a bit of Durbanville, and a bit of Stellenbosch. Also, again, out of the 4 award, we've got a great vineyard there that we farm ourselves. And so the West Coast cool vineyards, being the Durbanville and Darling, bring a lot of that aromatic power to the wine. A lot of that sort of, I hate talking about the green profile and the more fruit-driven profile because I think it's a bit overworked with Sauvignon, but there's a lot of that. There's that sort of ripe characters, there's a ripe green fig, and it's lovely and it's aromatic. And these wines have got great texture, but we've got this little parcel on Fora that's actually a little small, almost like a finger or a tongue of shale, which is not common in Stellenbosch. You see that more out in the Swartland around Riebeek West and Riebeek Kasteel. So you don't see a lot of shale, and there's a little bit of shale in the soil, and the wine that we get from it is actually quite neutral. It's got this beautiful oyster shell minerality, and it's got this beautiful structure, and this is what I love about the Sauvignon Blanc. It's not one of these wines that I refer to as a mushroom wine that's got this big, beautiful aromatic cap, and then it's lean and thin behind. This wine is quite bold up front, but then as you look at it on the palate, and as you get to the second glass, you start seeing a wine open up. We're very fortunate to taste a vertical of our family reserve Sauvignons, and we are blown away by wines. 2005 I think was one of our favorites, and people forget that really good Sauvignon Blanc ages beautifully, but it needs that minerality, it needs that texture. Without that, when the aromatics disappear, it falls apart. This wine absolutely sings when it starts getting a bit more mature.
Well, already at 2019, so just a couple of years old, it smacks you in the nose with a nice big green pepper and goes from there. And it does have a lot more to it than some of those narrow Sauvignon Blancs that you mentioned. There is one thing that is missing with this Sauvignon Blanc, though, Alistair, and that's a plate of Portuguese prawns. So I think let's call in Kaylee and get our first course going.
Thanks.
Kaylee, that looks fabulous. Right, so just to make it absolutely clear, normally I wouldn't eat these because I'm very strict in terms of fitness and diet, but purely to pair with the wine, Mr. Rimmer.
Yeah.
And I'm going to top yours up a little.
Absolutely.
Which one's your Chenin?
That's Chenin,
That's your Chenin.
Thank you.
All right. So if I told you, asked you beforehand what you'd select for these two particular wines, would prawns have been reasonably high on the list?
Yeah, absolutely. Specifically for the Chenin, I'm a seafood lover, and yeah, obviously we just had the last day of our crayfish season down in the Cape, and crayfish and prawns and Chenin go extremely well, and obviously up here with your proximity to Mozambique, as we know where these prawns come from, prawns and Chenin go equally well. And what I love is that little bit of spice, and that Chenin in particular has got enough richness. It's not sweet. There's enough richness that it won't fight with a little bit of heat that quite often happens on the Portuguese influenced prawn. So cheers,
All
Dan.
right, cheers.
Looking forward to it.
Likewise.
Oh boy.
Now, just in case you missed it earlier, just a reminder, we're at Tony G's in Bedfordview. Monica, who is Portuguese, oversees the kitchen. And I think, and I can't say this too loudly because her boyfriend Martin is here and he's much bigger than me, I think I'm falling in love with Monica. These prawns are amazing. So you've got two very, very happy wine people at Tony G's. Normally, if it's Alistair and I would be talking about the wine, but I'm afraid, as much as I love your wine, it's just slipped down the pecking order for a moment or two because those prawns are terrific.
I'm not going to take any offense. These prawns were spectacular.
All right, so we've done the white wine, we've done the prawns. The Chenin was lovely, but that Sauvignon Blanc just struck such a perfect note in combination. So Monica, Kaylee, thank you. You've got us off to a flying start. We're going to say goodbye to what little is left of these plates and move on to some red. Right, I'm actually feeling fairly full after all of those. I think we both demolished.
Yeah.
Any visions of just having a small prawn or two disappeared the moment we had tasted them, but there is still space for some wine and the red wines of Kleine Zalze. Is there a philosophy that has you leaning one way or the other in terms of the red or the white focus, or are you trying as an estate to strike a balance between the two?
Yeah, and I think it is definitely a case of we do find a bit of a balance. Me personally, and I know Kobus Besson, the owner of Kleine Zalze, RJ and my team, you know, we wine professionals by day, we wine geeks by night. We like too many different things just to do one. I think if you look at our new plantings, we've replanted pretty much the whole property at Kleine Zalze. We've tried to pick out what we think is true to our site there, true to the terroir of the farm, of the estate, for lack of better words. And you'll see there's quite a big focus on Cabernet and the supporting cast of Bordeaux varieties. There are some very good Shiraz sites. I think when Kobus established the business 25 years ago, it's our silver jubilee this year, he planted a bit of everything. He redeveloped the estate, he planted a bit of everything, as you did in the mid-90s. It was the booming time of wine and you had a bit of everything. And we've now had a really great opportunity over the last 5 years. We've started the replanting, we've still got another 3 years to go. So it's a full 8-year bit of planting, but it was a 10-year project from planning to the final vineyards being planted. We are focusing on our site, most probably more Cabernet driven. Stellenbosch is very well known for its Cabernet and quite rightly so. Some of the best Cabernets in the world are grown in Stellenbosch. Syrah or Shiraz has, I don't want to say less appeal in Stellenbosch, that's not what I say. The sites are more specific. And you've got to be quite particular about where your Shiraz is growing and how you treat it to get really to that level. And for us, it's quite a challenge. Our Shiraz at Kleine Zalze has most probably up to now been the most lauded and most awarded red wine in our portfolio, and maybe even awarded wine. And I think it's still doing pretty well for itself. The other wines are starting now to catch up. and we're starting to realize the uniqueness of the Cabernets of our site. So from an estate point of view, it's a red focus, but as a company, we South African, we think Chenin is really where you need to be. We've also built up a reputation for our Chenin Blancs. So nearly half our total volume in a year is Chenin Blanc. What a lot of people don't know.
That's a fair amount.
Yeah. So we do produce slightly more whites, but on the top level, it's most probably even. It's most probably split even money, maybe 45 red, 55 white, and across these 4 wines, obviously.
All right. Well, I'm fascinated to compare these because they both probably got 7 stars from John Platter, as everything you do always seems to have. But the Cabernet Shiraz story, and it's a small part of the greater Stellenbosch story, but Cabernet Sauvignon is generally the one that's up in lights, and especially 17 after 15, such a terrific vintage. And yet some of my favourite wines out of Stellenbosch, I think of the Gravel Hill, different part of Stellenbosch, but it's hard to get a better wine, red wine than that out of South Africa, let alone Stellenbosch. My wife would run away with and marry Kevin Arnold tomorrow if he'd let her. She's obsessed with his Shiraz, and I couldn't fault her really, because it really is good wine. And so this is a really cool challenge. Which one are we going with first?
Yeah, I'm going to throw a bit of a spanner here. I'm going to go with the Cabernet.
Okay.
I think where we've matured in our Cabernet styling, and I think where Kleine Zalze and the South African wine industry were chasing the wines of the Napa Valley, and we're making these very exuberant Cabernets. We've figured out how to find that middle ground, and I always like to say Stellenbosch, in a global perspective, offers that middle ground between Bordeaux and Napa, and you get the beautiful opulence of fruit out of what Napa is, and on the aromatics. But then on the structure, you get this very elegant, svelte, fine-grained tannin, quite a linear wine, not a horizontal wine. It's quite linear and direct, and it's got a great freshness and tightness to this. Whereas the Shiraz from 2017 is definitely a bit more exuberant, a bit more rich on the palate. It's going through a bit of an awkward phase. We just released these 2 wines less than a week ago, and it's showing quite a lot of that spice and other things. So again, a bit like the first 2 wines, the Cabernet is a bit more subdued at the moment. So let's have the more exuberant Shiraz after the Cabernet.
Probably the only challenge with this wine is to be, do I drink it now and it is eminently drinkable now, or do I try and put it away, in my case hide it from my wife, and in 5-10 years time bring it back out to resume the journey, because this wine has got a long way to go.
Yeah, I've got a bit of a similar challenge. Hide it from my wife, so I thought I'd leave it at my parents' house. But my dad's discovered my stash at his house, so on both sides, my wine's disappearing. So, but this wine will reward you if you look after it for a few years. It's going to be even better.
All right, there's a beautiful restraint to it. It's another tremendous example of this fabulous 2017 vintage of Cab Sav. What about the Shiraz? Your suggestion is it's going to be a little noisier, just as the Sauvignon Blanc had a bit more volume than that Chenin Blanc. Why is that the case?
Yeah, Dan, I think the 2017 is primarily off a parcel off our property. It's a beautiful vineyard, but Shiraz definitely, in the South African context, likes poor soils. If you think about a lot of the shale soils and a lot of the other areas, they'll have quite a lot of sand in the profile. They won't be that clay rich. And if I'm perfectly honest, ours have got quite a lot of clay in the subsoil. We sit on the Blauwklippen River there. So the top soil, it's a duplex, what we refer to as a duplex soil, but it's got 2 separate profiles. And that's where the duplex, the top profile is quite sandy, and the bottom's got quite a rich clay, well-drained clay, to where our Cabernets on top of the hill sit in and make great wines. But Shiraz is quite a vigorous growth. So we have a vigorous canopy that's relatively vigorous. And so to find that balance there, we've got a crop, and the ripening takes quite a long, slow ripening. And when we try and make the more elegant, more Rhône style wines, they lack personality. They're not ripe enough yet. The best Rhône wines are picked fully ripe, but they are naturally elegant. We make our Project Z Syrah. It's off a site, off of that shale site, off that property near Fora. It lends itself to that style, whereas this vineyard lends it to a bolder, richer style of wine. And so we let the site do what it wants to do.
So it's definitely one of the things I love about winemaking, and particularly in South Africa, where we have different areas where the styles are very different, sometimes different estates right next door to each other. You're both making the same wine, and yet the winemaker has been able to imprint his or her vision on that particular wine. And here we have a Shiraz. It's a lot bigger than a style we're seeing a lot of, and it means if you like this kind of Shiraz, it's there. If you like the other side, it's there. And if, like you and me, like both of them, you've got both of those options.
Yeah, absolutely. I think with anything, wine comes back to finding balance, and you can have the very elegant, beautiful perfumed Shiraz, but the bolder Shirazes can also be in balance. As long as they're in balance. I think this bigger, bolder styles got a lot of negative press, so to speak, because a lot of the wines were out of balance. They were just too heady and too everything and didn't lack substance behind it. Whereas wines like this, and you referenced Kevin Arnold, Gravel Hill, these really heady, intense wines, but they've got substance behind it. They've got the structure to carry the fruit. They've got everything, and they age quite well too as well. They're not just there for the show at the front. They go well, and we like to think we are starting to refine the style a bit. It's got a little bit more. I talked about linearity on the cab. I think this wine's got a little bit of linearity that also carries it a little bit better, and it's an exciting time for us.
So the wine is terrific. We've got two fabulous reds here. How do they go with the food though? And the challenge now moves away from Alistair and his wine and onto Monica and her kitchen, because her prawns, absolute rock star stuff. Yeah. Can the trinchado match up? So this is our final pairing, and if this works out, I'm going to tell Monica this is her secret weapon. Get in some Kleine Zalze Chenin Blanc.
There we are.
And it's I've had a conversation with numerous guys who make Chenin, unsurprisingly Ken Forrester being amongst them, and the fact that Chenin just has that ability to come out and meet head on with that Thai chicken curry or some samosas or something that's got that little bit of nip to it. And we've got exactly that here. And you're generally, red wine, red meat, white wine, we can't have that in South Africa. And yet I think this is going to prove that wrong quite considerably.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, Ken is Mr. Chenin in South Africa. And his FMC is one of the great wines that we've produced over the last couple of decades. Tasting older FMCs, they're awesome wines. And Ken is also very involved in Wagyu farming and cultivation and promoting Wagyu in South Africa. If you think about a Wagyu piece of beef, very rich, very bold, a lot of marbling, and his Chenins go unbelievably well with it. And so when you've got something so rich, there's something that refreshes the palate, something with a bit of acidity, but still with the structure to work with it. This wine with the again, it's not sugar sweetness, but it's a palate sweetness. It's a textural sweetness with a little bit of heat here. I on a summer's afternoon, I love Cabernet, I love steak and Cabernet, but when it's 35 degrees out, Cabernet gets a bit too much with rich food. This brings a lightness and a freshness, and it's going to work, absolutely.
Right, well, I've just tried it and I can confirm that it most certainly does work, but I'm just going to double up because research is very important. Dan really likes wine. Well, there's the perfect note on which to wrap up what has been a splendid lunch. The wine's been terrific, but no surprises there. Alistair keeps making absolutely brilliant wine. The food too, though. South African with a Portuguese slant. Together with that wine, we've had an absolutely indulgent and celebratory meal, and a great reminder of just how good South African food and wine can be. A huge thank you to Monica and to Kaylee and to Martijn and the team at Tony G's in Bedfordview. They're going to be sick of me soon because I'm planning to come back here just about every single day for those prawns in particular. The new Kleine Zalze range is now out. You can get a lot of the Kleine Zalze wines at Pick n Pay, and if you're a member of that Pick n Pay wine club, there are loads of great deals to be had. In the meantime, keep drinking, keep supporting South African wine, and if you're in Bedfordview, drop by at Tony G's. There's a good chance you'll see myself and Mr. Rimmer. Cheers.